Hello, this is Bob Bixby at the Concord Coalition, and I'm joined by Tori Gorman, our policy director. Good morning, Tori.
Good morning, Bob. How are you today?
Pretty good, pretty good. Well, on Friday afternoon, the CBO came out with that's the Congressional Budget Office, came out with some revised projections for the economy and the budget that were pretty eye-popping. Give us the highlights.
Sure. So the Congressional Budget Office put out their initial projections for the fiscal year, first in January and then in March. But obviously things have changed a lot since CBO released their last projections for the economy, as well as the fiscal budget, the federal budget situation. Last Friday, they released new numbers that reflect the dramatic changes in the U.S. economy as a result of the outbreak of the novel coronavirus and the subsequent policy responses that were made by the federal government. Specifically, CBO expects that in the second quarter of this year, the economy is going to contract significantly as a result of the stay-at-home orders and the temporary shuttering of non-essential businesses. Specifically, CBO expects that real GDP will decline by about 11.8% in the second quarter of this year, which is equivalent to a 40% annualized rate, which is an extraordinarily change and represents the real dire economic situation faced by many Americans today.
Yeah, that is truly astronomical for a change. And what was the effect that they thought it would have on the budget deficit?
Sure. So as a result of the decline in economic activity, the reduction in tax revenues, for example, people aren't working, they're not paying income taxes and payroll taxes. So the federal government's going to experience a decline in tax collections, but also as a result of the federal government's response, the 4 pieces of legislation that they've passed in order to help Americans get through this pandemic, things like unemployment insurance and paycheck protection program and payroll tax credits for small businesses. The spending side is also going to increase. So when you combine those two effects together, obviously you're going to expect the federal budget deficit for this year and potentially next year to be a lot larger. And that's exactly what CBO said. In fact, when they initially put their baseline projections out, there was an expectation that federal budget deficits this year and next year would be approximately $1 trillion. Well, as a result of the pandemic and the policy response to it, CBO is now projecting that the budget deficit for fiscal year 2020 is going to be $3.7 trillion, which is almost 4 times larger than what they were initially projecting. And then the budget deficit for 2021 is going to be around $2.1 trillion, which is almost twice. Well, it's twice what they were originally estimating. So obviously a significant impact on the federal budget deficit.
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me, kind of an underlying theme of the report, not to be overlooked, is that this is going to be around for a while. I mean, the growth effects and particularly their estimates of unemployment were really kind of prolonged. And what were they saying on the unemployment rate? What are their assumptions there?
Sure. So I think everybody will recall that when we entered this crisis, the labor market was operating at a very, very strong level, very robust. Employment was very robust. The unemployment rate was somewhere around 3.5%. But since the pandemic has struck and the resulting job losses associated with it, CBO is now projecting that in the second quarter of this year, unemployment will reach 14%. In the third quarter, 16%. They expect it to go down from there, but they don't expect it to drop like a stone. It's not like we're going to be back to 3.5% unemployment by the fourth quarter of this year. So yes, they do expect the impact on labor markets to extend into the next fiscal year, to 2021.
Yeah, and they were making some projections about social distancing. I mean, this is kind of a new thing about CBO having to estimate social distancing. That was not something that was in their repertoire before.
Exactly.
But part of the reason for I think that, a lot of us used to think when this began that we might have a V-shaped recovery. You go down sharply and then come back sharply, and it's beginning to look like a more prolonged so-called U-shaped recovery. That might even be an optimistic point of view because it means we wouldn't have a double dip sometime later on. But that, it's not looking like the V-shaped recovery, even though CBO does project that the economy will begin to bounce back a little bit in the third quarter, which begins in June.
Right, and I also think that the recovery we're going to experience is going to be very uneven. That you'll see certain sectors of the economy that might be able to open up and resume full capacity, but then there are others that will take a while. I mean, I think there are certain industries that rely on people being in close quarters, whether it's restaurants and bars and concert venues, sporting events, et cetera, things like that. We're just not going to be able to flip the switch on those this summer or this fall. Those sorts of, as you said, the social distancing, I think, is going to be around for a long time. And so we've got some sort of vaccine. And so I think the recovery that you see in those industries are going to be much, much slower.
Yeah, so it's going to have a depressing effect on GDP and unemployment for a long time, which means that the budget deficit and the debt is going to be significantly higher. And one of the developing problems, really, for policymakers is going to be this question of how big can the deficit get, and how quickly can the economy recover consistent with the advice of public health officials. So I guess, Tori, the bottom line is that you and I are going to be speaking remotely like this for quite some time. Exactly.
But eventually, the economy will pivot. Once the end of the crisis draws closer, the economy will pivot. And that's why I'm glad we've got organizations like Concord Coalition around, so that we're here to remind lawmakers that, once the crisis is past, it's time to refocus our attention on federal debt and deficits and do something about them. So I'm happy to see that Concord's keeping a watchful eye on the budget deficit and debt and policy responses by the federal government.
Well, let's look forward to that day, oddly enough, when we can start worrying about the debt and the deficit again.
Exactly.
All right, Tori, thanks a lot. And folks, stay safe, and we'll be talking to you again soon.